The bed in the room across from his had been slept in. He had not slept in it. He had not touched it. He had locked the door and kept the key. But something had been lying there in the dark while he dreamed on the other side of the room about a pale thing pursuing a man across a winter beach. Welcome back to the Dark Archives. I am the Chronicler. Tonight we conclude the record. Oh Whistle, and I'll Come to You, My Lad, by M.R. James. If you have not heard part 1, I would recommend rectifying that before continuing. The record is not improved by beginning in the middle.
For those who are current, Professor Parkins has blown the whistle. He has had the dream. He has dismissed both as the products of an overworked brain, and he has gone about the following day with the cheerful efficiency of a man whose rationalism has survived the night intact. This is, as we noted, precisely the wrong response, but it is entirely the response a man like Parkins would give. James knew that. He built the entire engine of this story around it.
What follows is the second and final night. The thing that answered the whistle is no longer merely a dream. It has found the room. It has made itself a body from the materials available. And Professor Parkins, a man who has never in his life been frightened of anything he could not explain, is about to discover what it costs to encounter something that cannot be explained. The record resumes. The morning after the first night, a maid came to make up Parkins' room and asked which bed he wanted the extra blanket on. Parkins pointed to his own bed. The maid looked at him with the careful neutrality of someone who has learned not to contradict paying guests, and said that they had made up both beds that morning, as both seemed to have been slept in. Parkins said this was impossible. He certainly hadn't touched the other bed. The maid said, with that same careful neutrality, that the other bed's clothes had been crumpled and thrown about always, quite as if anyone hadn't passed but a very poor night. Then she took her extra blanket and departed. Parkins decided that he must have disordered it while unpacking. He went out to golf with the Colonel and improved his game considerably. The Colonel, on the links, mentioned that in his experience there was generally something at the bottom of what country folk held to, particularly this business of whistling for the wind. Interesting that they'd had such a wind the night before. Extraordinary thing that. He didn't suppose Parkins had been whistling for it, had he? Parkins, who was now curious rather than troubled, told the Colonel the full story of the whistle. The Colonel turned it over gingerly when Parkins showed it to him that evening, and said that if it were his, he'd chuck it straight into the sea. He'd been around long enough to know that objects belonging to certain orders of papists were not something a sensible man should be putting to his lips. He was being gently rhetorical, perhaps. He was also entirely correct. If this record is proving its worth, the like button is how you note it in the margin. The archive appreciates the acknowledgement. The Colonel took this very seriously. Parkins found he was unable to dismiss it quite as easily as he would have liked. They went upstairs. The door to Parkins' room was locked. He had the key. When they opened it and lit the candles, nothing appeared disturbed. But the empty bed, the bed Parkins did not use, the bed the maid had found disordered that morning, the bed that should have been empty, had its clothes bundled and twisted together in a tortuous confusion that Parkins could not attribute to unpacking, because he had not unpacked into it, and could not attribute to the maid, because the maid had made it that morning, and the door had been locked since. No one else had a key. The landlord confirmed it. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been moved, except the bedclothes. The Colonel was very quiet that evening. At dinner, he said almost nothing. When he bade Parkins good night, he said, quietly, that Parkins knew where to find him if he needed him in the night. Parkins said he was certain he wouldn't need him. He held the whistle up in the candlelight, and they both looked at it. The Colonel said he'd throw it in the sea. Parkins said he'd probably take it back to Cambridge and show it to the archaeologists. Each man was perfectly sincere. The Colonel went upstairs. Parkins went to his room. He arranged himself for sleep with some ingenuity. There were no blinds or curtains on his windows, and a bright moon was rising to shine directly onto his bed, which would disturb him. He constructed a screen from a railway rug, some safety pins, a stick, and an umbrella. And this, if it held, would block the moonlight entirely. He read until he was sleepy. He blew out the candle. He slept. An hour later, perhaps more, the screen collapsed. The moonlight came in. It was bright, frosty, hard, very bright. He lay for some minutes deciding whether to get up and reconstruct the screen. He decided against it. He turned over, and then he went very still. There had been a movement, he was sure, in the empty bed across the room. He lay there listening. There was a rustling, a shaking, more than any rat could cause. He lay perfectly still and waited and told himself it was rats, and did not believe it and waited some more. The figure in the empty bed sat up. He was out of his own bed in one bound. He went for the window, the stick from the dismantled screen, some instinct for a weapon. And this was the worst thing he could have done, because the figure with a sudden smooth motion slid from the bed and placed itself between the two beds, between him and the door, arms spread wide, blocking the exit, or perhaps searching for him. It was difficult to tell. He stood at the window and watched it. It was moving in a stooping posture, groping with its arms, muffled arms, drapery-wrapped arms, in a searching, random way. It seemed, with enormous relief and equal horror, to be blind. It could not see him. It was feeling for him. It found the empty bed he had just left, moved to it, bent over the pillow, and felt across the sheets, in a way that Parkins later said he could not describe and did not wish to. Then it rose. It moved into the band of moonlight from the window, and it showed its face. He had described it once to James himself, who recorded it. What Parkins chiefly remembered was a face of crumpled linen, a face like a bedsheet folded and pressed into the shape of a face. He could not say what expression it wore. He could say that the fear of it went close to destroying his mind. It crossed the room too fast. One corner of its draperies swept across Parkins's face. He made a sound, He could not help it, and the sound was enough. It turned. It knew where he was. It launched itself at him. He was halfway out of the window, backwards, screaming, when the colonel burst through the door. The colonel had good hearing and a soldier's instincts and was apparently not very surprised by what he found. He took in the scene, the figure, the window, Parkins half through it, and he crossed the room with the speed and certainty of a man who has dealt with things he doesn't discuss. By the time he reached them, there was only Parkins. He pulled him back through the window. Parkins fainted. On the floor between the beds was a heap of tumbled bedclothes. Nothing else. The colonel sat in the other bed for the rest of the night, wrapped in a rug, and did not sleep, and said nothing about any of it to anyone except Rogers, who arrived the following morning and heard the full account. At the end of a long consultation, the colonel walked to the sea and threw the whistle as far as his considerable arm could send it. Later that day, smoke rose from behind the Globe Inn. The bedclothes presumably had been dealt with. Parkins was cleared of any suspicion of delirium tremens. The hotel was cleared of any reputation for disturbance. Some explanation was provided to the staff, though James does not record what it was. Parkins was cleared of any suspicion of delirium tremens. The hotel was cleared of any reputation for disturbance. Some explanation was provided to the staff, though James does not record what it was. The record is complete, filed and sealed. There are two things worth noting before we close it. The face, James describes it only once, in the words Parkins could bring himself to use. A face of crumpled linen. He does not elaborate. He does not explain what looked out through it as Parkins hung half through the window. That withholding is the whole of James's art. What we imagine is always worse than what we are told. If this entry earned its place in your evening, the like button is how you tell the archive it mattered. Before you go, a question worth considering. The colonel, after everything he witnessed that night, concluded that the thing could really have done very little except frighten. Do you believe that? Leave your answer below. The archive keeps all records, new entries added to the dark archives every Friday. Subscribe, no record should go unwitnessed. And this, Professor Parkins cannot now see a surplice hanging on a door without his hands beginning to shake. He still does not believe in the supernatural. He has simply stopped being able to say so. Until next time, the archives remain open.